Hello, I'm John Treadgold for the Finance News Network, and joining me today at Sydney's Town Hall is former World Bank Chief Economist and Nobel Prize winner, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Professor, welcome to Sydney.
Nice to be here.
A lot of your work has focused on understanding growing inequality in developed markets. Is there a threat that inequality could reverse some of the strong economic growth that Australia has experienced in the past decade?
Very much so. Studies done by the IMF and others have shown that countries with greater inequality are likely to experience lower economic growth and more instability. So if Australia follows the common pattern, and there are good reasons for this pattern, then the growing inequality in Australia will be followed by weaker economic performance and more instability.
What policy settings could you suggest that would help to lessen inequality in order to maintain prosperity?
Well, let me say, first we want to begin with making sure that it doesn't get worse. And your education system, your health system, your support for families through welfare system are all important ingredients in the current Australian model. Important to have progressive taxation. Important to make sure that those at the top pay their fair share of taxes, and because they're more able to pay than those at the bottom, the percentage of their income that they pay in taxes should be higher than those at the bottom. Particularly important that to close kind of loopholes that allow large amounts of high income money to escape taxation. There are loopholes caused by capital gains, caused by superannuation schemes that allow very wealthy people to put aside large amounts of money tax-free, which cost the Treasury an enormous amount of money, money that could be spent on investments in people, on technology and infrastructure, all of which would raise standards of living. There are a whole set of other policies that are important for fighting inequality, fighting monopolies, fighting discrimination, making sure you have good corporate governance laws to make sure that those that CEOs can't grab for themselves a large fraction of the revenues of corporations, good financial laws to make sure that the banks don't engage in predatory lending, abusive credit card practices, the kinds of things that banks in other countries have engaged in massive amounts.
Well, that brings me on to the next question of regulation of financial markets. It's a hot topic both here and in the US. What do you think needs to be done to manage risk and avoid another global financial crisis?
We clearly haven't done enough. In the United States, for instance, we have banks that are too big to fail, too interconnected, too correlated to fail. They're actually too big to jail. They're too big to be managed. And they've caused all kinds of problems to our economic system. But it's interesting, all the focus has been on trying to prevent them from doing harm to the rest of the economy. There's not enough talk about how do we make sure that the financial sector actually does what it's supposed to do. Allocate capital, manage risk, run a payments mechanism, all at low cost. These are things that good financial systems do. And in some countries, particularly in the United States, they've not been doing these basic functions well. So while they expose the economies to enormous risk, while they've engaged in, I would say, a whole variety of abusive practices, they actually haven't been providing the kind of services that they should be providing.
That brings me on to the question of your academic work looks at these assumptions of perfect markets. Have you indicated that you still believe in overall market-based system? How do they reconcile with your approach to investment and capital growth?
Well, the way I think about it is I actually think that the part of the agenda here is to try to make markets work like markets. The real problem is that we've developed what I sometimes call an ersatz version of capitalism, where we socialize losses but privatize gains, where we have massive bailouts to the banks and we leave homeowners on their own, where we allow monopoly powers, abuses of corporate governance. All these things are things that are not part of textbook economics of competitive markets. These are really undermining the working of a market economy. So I think we have to understand that what we have in most of the advanced countries is not a traditional textbook market economy, competitive market. We have a mixture of monopolies and managerial capitalism and political influence, exploitation, and unfortunately that mix has not been serving most citizens, certainly in the United States, but in many of the other advanced countries.
And Australia is currently in negotiations as part of the TransPacific Partnership free trade agreement. You've recently raised some concern about the intentions of the agreement. Do you think it's a good deal for Australia?
I think all countries that are party to this agreement ought to worry. They ought to worry first because there's a certain lack of transparency. Even people in the U.S. government have had trouble figuring out what the U.S. the USTR's negotiating position is, what they're asking for. Part of the trade agreement is a provision called an investment agreement. And the investment agreement is designed to protect special interests, not to have better property rights. But for instance, these kinds of provisions are being used all over the world to undermine health standards, environmental standards, safety standards, undermine the basic structure that has enabled market economies to function. In fact, the USTR doesn't seem to understand that we had a crisis in 2008, and that the response to the crisis was, in many countries, to adopt stronger financial sector regulations to make sure that the financial sector serves the rest of the economy, doesn't undertake excessive risk, and there are provisions that might restrict the ability of governments to undertake these kinds of regulation. Another set of provisions that's really adverse are those that are associated with intellectual property. Now, most people believe in intellectual property, but this is not about just ordinary protection. This is extending the market power of American pharmaceutical companies to go well beyond the provisions that, for instance, apply in the United States. Make it more difficult to get access to generic medicines, raising costs of providing health care to Australian citizens. So yes, I think you ought to really think twice before you sign this agreement, and at the very least, negotiate. Remember, this is not a free trade agreement. It's not a partnership. At least not a partnership among equals. It's a managed trade agreement, mostly managed for special interests in the United States.
Professor Stiglitz, thank you for your time.
Thank you.